Who governs the invisible city? In the vast expanse of the American landscape, there are territories where the social contract has not just frayed, it has been completely rewritten. To an outside observer, a distressed urban neighborhood appears to be a vacuum of order, a chaotic sprawl of neglect and random violence. This perception is the first and most significant analytical error. There is no such thing as a power vacuum in human geography. When the state loses its monopoly on the legitimate use of force, the street does not descend into lawlessness. Instead, it develops a parallel legal system that is often faster, more consistent, and infinitely more brutal than any state-sanctioned court. This is the parallel state, a cold and utilitarian structure where the primary objective is not justice, but the maintenance of commerce. The foundational doctrine of this state is the refusal to cooperate with external authorities, a concept widely misunderstood as a simple code of silence. In reality, the prohibition against informing is a jurisdictional boundary. It is a pragmatic recognition that once a dispute enters the official legal system, the street loses control over the outcome. For the residents of these blocks, the police are not a service. They are a foreign entity that documents tragedy without preventing it. To survive, the neighborhood creates its own judiciary, where the laws are unspoken, the evidence is gathered through eyes on the street, and the sentencing is immediate. This system operates with a clinical lack of emotion, viewing human life as a variable in a larger economic equation. The parallel state exists because it has to. It is the natural byproduct of an environment where the official government has failed to provide the basic requirements of stability. In the following investigation, the mechanics of this hidden governance are dissected, revealing a world where territorial markers are zoning laws, recruitment is a dark mirror of corporate vetting, and the ultimate penalty is a tool for brand management. The anatomy of the block begins with the understanding of territory as a tangible asset. In the history of the Crips and the Bloods in Los Angeles, land was the first and last point of contention. To the city, a block is a collection of parcels and streetlights. To the street, a block is a revenue stream with fixed overhead and high security requirements. The physical stakes are defined by the borders. These borders are not marked by fences, but by the aesthetic of the neighborhood, specific colors, hand signs, and the silent consensus of the inhabitants. The territory is a physical extension of the gang's brand. If a rival presence is allowed to exist within these borders, the brand is diluted, and the perceived power of the local judiciary is weakened. This leads to the first paradox of the parallel state. To maintain order, it must periodically engage in extreme disorder. The physical stakes for a resident are high because the neighborhood is both a home and a battlefield. For the soldier, the stakes are existential. Their position within the hierarchy is determined by their ability to enforce the invisible laws of the territory. This is not about bravado. It is about the management of a social and economic ecosystem that depends on the predictability of violence. If a debt is not collected, the system fails. If a territorial infringement is ignored, the borders collapse. The anatomy of the block is therefore a study in high-stakes management where the cost of failure is not a loss in quarterly earnings, but the loss of physical sovereignty. The first investigation into this parallel state focuses on the mechanics of the green light. In the hierarchy of street politics, specifically within the influence of the Mexican mafia over Southern California street gangs, the green light is the street's version of a death warrant. It is a formal judicial ruling issued by a higher authority that authorizes and often mandates the removal of an individual or an entire set from the ecosystem. This fact reveals the professionalized nature of street violence. It is rarely a result of a sudden emotional outburst. Instead, a green light is the conclusion of a deliberate process. The individual has become a liability to the block's brand or the collective economic interests of the hierarchy. They may have violated the terms of a tax agreement, drawn too much heat from federal authorities, or committed an act that destabilizes the internal peace. The paradox of power here is that the more authority a shot caller has, the less they actually want to use the green light. Frequent use of the ultimate penalty indicates a failure of diplomacy and a lack of control. It creates internal friction and invites outside scrutiny. However, when the order is given, the harsh reality is that the target is often isolated by their own peers. The very people who provided protection for the individual will be the ones to enforce the sentence, as failing to do so would result in a green light being placed on them as well. The consequence of this system is a culture of hypervigilance and absolute conformity. The individual is constantly being measured against their utility to the collective. In this parallel judiciary, there is no appeal process and no statute of limitations. The green light ensures that the hierarchy remains intact by surgically removing any element that threatens the stability of the trade. The second investigation looks at the zoning laws of the street, the territorial markers, and the green light system's counterpart, the management of the spot. Every drug market or trap functions as a highly regulated commercial zone. The fact is that these locations are not chosen at random. They are selected for their proximity to transit, their line of sight for security, and their distance from police substations. The mechanics of the spot mirror those of a franchise. There is a manager, a security detail, and a sales force. The paradox of this territorial control is that while it provides a livelihood for many, it simultaneously destroys the long-term value of the very land it occupies. To keep the spot profitable, the street must enforce a quiet zone. Paradoxically, the most successful drug spots are those that attract the least amount of police attention, which means the soldiers often act as a more effective police force than the city itself. They will remove petty thieves, suppress loud disputes, and ensure the sidewalks are clear, not out of civic duty, but to protect the retail environment. The harsh reality, however, is that this protection is predatory. The neighborhood is kept stable only as long as it remains profitable. The moment the spot is no longer viable, the security vanishes, leaving a vacuum that is often filled by even more desperate and less organized factions. The consequence for the community is a state of perpetual economic arrested development. No legitimate business can compete with the informal economy's overhead or its methods of dispute resolution. The parallel state thus preserves the neighborhood in a state of profitable decay. The third investigation explores the vetting process for new recruits, which functions as a dark mirror to corporate background checks. In the 1980s and 90s, as the Bloods and Crips expanded, the recruitment process became increasingly formalized. It was no longer enough to simply live on the block. A prospective soldier had to prove their reliability through a series of tasks that tested their loyalty and their capacity for violence. This is the street's version of a probationary period. The fact is that these organizations are looking for specific psychological traits: high risk tolerance, emotional detachment, and a deep-seated need for belonging. The paradox is that the very traits that make a recruit effective in the short term, aggression and impulsivity, are the same traits that eventually make them a liability to the organization's long-term stability. A soldier who is too violent attracts the wrong kind of attention, yet a soldier who is not violent enough cannot defend the territory. The harsh reality of this vetting is that it targets the most vulnerable members of the community, offering them a false sense of family that is entirely contingent on their performance. If a recruit is arrested, the family rarely pays for a lawyer or supports the recruit's dependents. Instead, the recruit is often viewed as a burnt asset. The consequence is a generational cycle of disposable labor. The street consumes the youth of the neighborhood, uses them to maintain the parallel state's borders, and then discards them the moment they become a legal or physical liability. This recruitment process ensures that the hierarchy always has a fresh supply of soldiers to replace those lost to the state's prisons or the street's morgues. The fourth investigation focuses on the Judiciary of Debt. In the informal economy, there are no contracts, no credit scores, and no small claims courts. Credit is extended based on reputation, and debt is secured by the threat of physical harm. This is perhaps the most efficient part of the parallel state. When a dealer fronts product to a lower-level soldier, they are entering into a high-stakes financial agreement. The fact is that debt collection on the block is handled with a clinical precision that would be familiar to any corporate liquidator. If a debt is not paid, the process follows a standardized escalation. First, a warning. Second, a physical tax. And third, the total seizure of assets, which often includes the debtor's physical safety. The paradox here is that the parallel state depends on a high level of trust. Without the ability to extend credit, the entire economic machine would grind to a halt. Yet, this trust is built entirely on the foundation of fear. The harsh reality is that in this system, there is no such thing as bankruptcy protection. An individual who loses a shipment or has their product seized by police is still liable for the debt. The shot callers do not accept bad luck as an excuse. The consequence is that many individuals are forced into more extreme acts of violence or riskier criminal ventures just to satisfy a debt to the hierarchy. This creates a feedback loop of escalation where the pressure of the debt drives the level of violence higher, further destabilizing the neighborhood and inviting more federal intervention. The expansion of the parallel state is most visible in its sophisticated system of taxation, a mechanism that links the concrete of the street to the steel of the prison cell. In the early 1990s, the Mexican Mafia, or LAIM, issued a series of mandates that fundamentally altered the landscape of Southern California street politics. These were not suggestions. They were legislative edicts. The most significant was a ban on drive-by shootings, a tactic that had become a hallmark of gang warfare, but was now drawing an unsustainable amount of law enforcement pressure and collateral damage. This directive was a calculated move to stabilize the retail environment and protect the Block's brand. By shifting from high-profile drive-bys to targeted, close-range assassinations, the parallel state demonstrated a preference for surgical efficiency over chaotic terror. The mandate was enforced through a taxation system where every local set or neighborhood was required to pay a percentage of their earnings upward to the prison-based hierarchy. In exchange, the neighborhood received insurance, the guarantee that their members would be protected while incarcerated and that their territorial claims would be recognized by the central authority. The paradox of this taxation is that it creates a feedback loop of dependency. The street gang becomes a subsidiary of the prison gang, and the local economy is drained of capital to fund a hidden government that only provides protection from itself. The harsh reality is that this system turns every street-level transaction into a contribution to a transnational criminal infrastructure. The consequence for the foot soldier is that they are taxed both by the state, through the inevitable seizure of assets and incarceration, and by the street through a mandatory tithe that offers no social services in return. Beyond the financial and judicial aspects, the parallel state relies on a sophisticated intelligence infrastructure. In a neighborhood where the official authorities are viewed as an occupying force, the population itself becomes the eyes and ears of the informal government. This is not always a matter of active cooperation. It is a matter of environmental adaptation. The eyes on the street include everyone from the lookout standing on a milk crate to the grandmother watching from a second-story window. Information is the primary currency. The mechanics of this intelligence gathering are informal but highly effective. A suspicious vehicle, an unfamiliar face, or a change in police patrol patterns is communicated through a network of signals, coded language, and rapid response messaging. The paradox of power in this context is that the parallel state achieves a level of surveillance that the actual state, with all its technology and constitutional constraints, can never match. The neighborhood becomes a panopticon where everyone is both the watcher and the watched. This creates a culture of profound social isolation within a densely populated area. The harsh reality is that this intelligence network is not designed to protect the residents from crime, but to protect the commerce from interference. If a civilian provides information to the parallel state, they are seen as a collaborator. If they provide it to the actual state, they are seen as a traitor. The consequence is a no-man's land of communication where the truth is a dangerous commodity that can lead to a green light if handled incorrectly. The logistics of the stash house serve as a further case study in the clinical efficiency of street mechanics. A stash house is more than a storage facility. It is a high-security node in a decentralized supply chain. Its location is a closely guarded secret, often hidden in plain sight within residential apartment complexes or suburban homes. The selection process for a stash house is a study in risk management. The parallel state avoids properties that are too dilapidated, which would attract building inspectors, or too ostentatious, which would attract neighbors' curiosity. The ideal location is the invisible middle, a property that blends perfectly into the mundane background of working-class life. The mechanics of operation involve strict protocols for entry and exit, often using mules or runners who have no knowledge of the larger organization, ensuring that if one node is compromised, the rest of the network remains intact. The paradox is that the more secure a stash house becomes, the more it resembles a prison for those tasked with guarding it. The individuals inside are often forbidden from leaving for weeks at a time, living in a state of hypervigilance and sensory deprivation. The harsh reality is that these properties are often rented through coercion or from vulnerable individuals who are unable to refuse. When the state eventually raids a stash house, it is the low-level caretakers and the property owners who bear the legal brunt, while the high-level organizers simply shift their operations to a new, pre-vetted location. The consequence is the continuous degradation of the residential housing stock, as homes are converted into temporary warehouses for a trade that views the neighborhood as a disposable resource. The unifying theory of the parallel state is that it is the inevitable byproduct of institutional scarcity. When a community is denied access to legitimate means of dispute resolution, economic advancement, and physical security, it will manufacture its own versions of these institutions out of whatever materials are at hand. The cycle of the streets is nearly impossible to break because the parallel state is not just a criminal enterprise. It is a social and economic coping mechanism that has become self-perpetuating. The tragedy is that the stability it provides is a mirage. It offers order, but it is an order based on the threat of immediate violence. It offers employment, but it is employment with a 100% turnover rate through death or imprisonment. It offers a sense of identity, but it is an identity that requires the systematic dehumanization of one's neighbors. The parallel state exists in the shadow of the actual state, feeding on its failures and growing stronger every time a legitimate institution retreats. The no-snitching code, the green light, and the territorial zoning laws are all parts of a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting a world where the only law that matters is the law of utility. As long as the vacuum of legitimate authority remains, the bloc will continue to govern itself with a brutal, clinical efficiency that prioritizes the brand over the person and the profit over the life. The streets do not change because the system is working exactly as it was designed to. It is a machine that converts human potential into raw capital, leaving behind a wake of broken families and boarded-up windows. The parallel state is a cold, unfeeling architect that builds walls where there should be bridges and creates laws where there should be justice. We look at these neighborhoods and see chaos, but if we look closer, we see a rigid, uncompromising order. It is an order that demands everything and gives nothing back. It is the unspoken law of the bloc, a judiciary that never sleeps and a sentence that never ends. In the end, the question is not how we dismantle the parallel state, but whether we are willing to build something in its place that is strong enough to survive the vacuum. The bloc's brand is built on the silence of the many and the violence of the few, a dark social contract that persists because the alternative has been made to feel impossible. As we walk away from these streets, the invisible city remains, governed by the same unspoken laws that have ruled it for generations. If you value this deep dive into the hidden structures of our cities and the mechanics of the parallel state, consider subscribing to Tales from the Block for more analytical investigations into the world beneath the surface. The logistics of communication within the parallel state are most clearly defined by the kite system, a sophisticated, analog method of information transfer that bridges the gap between the maximum security cell and the corner. In an era of pervasive digital surveillance, the written word remains the most secure form of legislation for the street's judiciary. These kites are not mere letters. They are legal documents, often written in microscopic script on scraps of paper, containing orders for taxation, territorial shifts, and the authorization of violence. The mechanics of the kite system require a multi-layered courier network involving legal visitors, compromised staff, and family members who act as unwitting or coerced conduits. The paradox of this system is that while it is designed for secrecy, it creates a permanent, physical record of the parallel state's activities. The paperwork, as it is known on the street, becomes a tool for internal vetting. A soldier's status can be destroyed instantly by the production of paperwork suggesting they have cooperated with the official state. The harsh reality of this system is that the paperwork is often forged or manipulated by rivals to justify the removal of a competitor. In this environment, the truth is secondary to the authenticity of the document. The consequence is a society governed by a secret bureaucracy where a single scrap of paper can determine the survival of an entire neighborhood set. The diplomatic core of the parallel state is best observed during the sit-down. When two rival factions, such as the various sets of the Bloods and Crips, reach a point where conflict is no longer profitable, they engage in a formal negotiation process that mirrors international symmetry. The fact is that prolonged street warfare is bad for the bottom line. It increases police presence, drives away the customer base, and depletes the soldier pool. The 1992 Watts Truce serves as a primary case study in this mechanic. Following the unrest in Los Angeles, leadership from the Grape Street Watts Crips, the PJ Watts Crips, and the Bounty Hunter Bloods drafted a formal peace treaty. This was not a sentimental gesture of brotherhood. It was a pragmatic recognition that the common enemy, the official state's law enforcement, was becoming too effective due to the gang's internal divisions. The mechanics of the truce involved creating neutral zones and establishing a cross-gang council to adjudicate disputes without resorting to gunfire. The paradox of these peace treaties is that they are often more fragile than the wars they end. Without an external authority to enforce the terms, the truce relies entirely on the continued profitability of peace. The harsh reality is that a single renegade soldier can trigger a collapse of the entire diplomatic structure. The consequence is that the parallel state is in a constant cycle of negotiation and betrayal, where the peace is merely a period of rearming and economic consolidation. The physical geography of the housing project provides the parallel state with a natural fortress. Architects and urban planners in the mid-20th century designed these complexes with high-density clusters and limited points of egress, inadvertently creating the perfect environment for an insular governance system. The fact is that the architectural layout of places like the Jordan Downs or Nickerson Gardens in Los Angeles allows for total environmental control. Lookouts positioned on rooftops or at the narrow entry choke points can monitor every vehicle and pedestrian entering the territory. The mechanics of this control turn the housing project into a no-go zone for unescorted official authorities. The paradox of the project as fortress is that the same features that keep the police out also trap the residents in. The physical isolation breeds a psychological isolation, reinforcing the authority of the parallel state as the only functional power within the walls. The harsh reality is that the residents become human shields for the commercial operations of the gang. Any police action to dismantle the parallel state's infrastructure is viewed by the community as an invasion of their home, further alienating the populace from the official government. The consequence is a fortress mentality that passes from generation to generation, where the authority of the bloc is seen as the only legitimate protection against an indifferent or hostile outside world. The economic logic of the re-up is the heartbeat of the bloc's commerce. This is the moment when the street-level inventory is replenished, and it is the point of maximum vulnerability for the organization. The fact is that the parallel state operates on a just-in-time delivery model to minimize the risk of large-scale asset seizure. The re-up involves a complex coordination between the wholesaler, often a high-level figure with ties to international cartels, and the neighborhood shot caller. The mechanics require a temporary suspension of other activities to focus all resources on security and logistics. The paradox of the re-up is that it requires the most secrecy at the very moment when the organization must be most active. The harsh reality is that this is where the vulture elements of the street emerge. Rival sets or stick-up crews wait for these moments of high-value transport to stage setups. The consequence is that the parallel state must maintain a standing army not just to fight the police, but to protect its own internal supply chain from its own peers. This internal predation ensures that the cost of doing business remains high, and the profit margins are constantly squeezed by the need for ever-increasing security expenditures. The role of the protectorate extends to the civilian population through a system of street taxes. While the gang provides protection to local businesses, unlicensed vendors, gypsy cabs, and even legitimate storefronts, this is rarely a voluntary transaction. The fact is that in many neighborhoods, a protection fee is the only way to ensure that a business is not robbed or vandalized by the very people who are supposedly protecting it. The mechanics of this extortion are often disguised as a community fund or a security fee. The paradox of the protectorate is that it creates a predatory stability. The neighborhood is safe from outside criminals, but it is owned by the inside organization. The harsh reality is that the parallel state views the civilian population as a taxable resource rather than a constituency. If a business owner refuses to pay, The parallel state does not simply withdraw its protection. It actively destroys the asset to send a message to the rest of the market. The consequence is a stifling of legitimate economic growth. Entrepreneurs flee the neighborhood to avoid the street tax, leaving behind only those businesses that are either owned by the gang or are too small to be worth the trouble. This ensures that the neighborhood remains economically dependent on the informal economy, further cementing the parallel state's power. The succession crisis is the most volatile period in the life cycle of any street organization. When a senior figure is removed, either through a long-term prison sentence or a green light, the resulting vacuum triggers a scramble for authority. The fact is that, unlike a corporation or a legitimate government, the parallel state has no formal line of succession. Power is seized, not inherited. The mechanics of succession involve a period of testing, where various mid-level soldiers attempt to consolidate their influence through displays of force or by securing the loyalty of the primary earners. The paradox of power in this transition is that the most aggressive candidate is often the most successful in the short term, but the least capable of maintaining the block's brand over time. The harsh reality of succession is that it often leads to civil war within a single gang, where former allies become mortal enemies over the control of a specific corner or spot. The consequence is a period of heightened violence that draws massive police attention, leading to the Operation Clean Sweep style raids that can decapitate the entire organization. The parallel state is thus caught in a cycle of self-destruction, where its own methods of leadership selection ensure its eventual downfall. The burnt asset protocol is the parallel state's method of dealing with compromised members. When a soldier is arrested, the organization's first priority is to determine the likelihood of that individual flipping or cooperating with the state. The fact is that the street's legal system has a zero-tolerance policy for cooperation, but the implementation of this policy is often clinical. The mechanics involve monitoring the individual's court proceedings, their behavior in county jail, and the statements of their legal counsel. If the individual is deemed burnt, the parallel state initiates a process of total social and physical erasure. The paradox is that the more a soldier has sacrificed for the organization, the more likely they are to be viewed as a high-value flip by the police, and therefore the more dangerous they become to their own peers. The harsh reality is that the family loyalty promised during recruitment evaporates the moment an indictment is handed down. The consequence is a culture of profound paranoia among the rank and file. Every soldier knows that their life is only valuable as long as they are on the street and clean. The moment they enter the official legal system, they are no longer a person. They are a potential threat to be neutralized. The mule and the runner represent the disposable labor force of the parallel state. These individuals, often chosen for their lack of criminal record or their inconspicuous appearance, such as single mothers or elderly residents, carry the physical risk of the trade. The fact is that the higher-level shot callers rarely touch the product or the money. The mechanics of the handoff are designed to create layers of plausible deniability. The paradox of the mule is that while they are the most vulnerable to arrest, they are also the least informed about the overall operation. This is need-to-know logistics at its most brutal. The harsh reality is that if a mule is caught, the organization does not see it as a human tragedy, but as a cost of goods sold. They will not provide bail, and they will not support the mule's family. In fact, if the mule loses the shipment during the arrest, they may emerge from prison owing a debt to the organization for the lost revenue. The consequence is the systematic exploitation of the most desperate members of the community, who are traded for a few $100s and the privilege of not being a target of the organization. The exit strategy is the ultimate myth of the parallel state. For those who have reached the middle or upper tiers of the hierarchy, there is a common narrative of getting out, of laundering enough money to start a legitimate business or moving the family to a different state. The fact is that the parallel state does not allow for retirement. The mechanics of the system are designed to keep participants tethered through debt, shared secrets, and the constant threat of paperwork emerging from the past. The paradox of the exit is that the more successful an individual becomes in the informal economy, the more invested the organization is in keeping them active. A successful earner is a resource that the hierarchy cannot afford to lose. The harsh reality is that getting out usually only happens in one of two ways: Fed time, or the pine box. Those who attempt to walk away without permission are viewed as a security risk. After all, they know where the bodies are buried and how the money is moved. The consequence is a lifetime appointment to a career of stress and violence, where the only true exit is a total loss of everything the individual worked to build. The vetting of the neighborhood extends to the very children who grow up in the shadow of the parallel state. The recruitment process begins not with a formal invitation, but with a gradual desensitization. The fact is that for a child in a high-intensity block, the gang is the most visible and consistent social service available. They provide the back-to-school giveaways, the summer barbecues, and the security on the playground. The mechanics of this grooming are subtle, aimed at creating a sense of us versus them from a young age. The paradox is that the organization creates the very danger that it then protects the children from. The harsh reality is that the parallel state is a parasite that feeds on the absence of a father figure or a stable home life, offering a distorted version of masculinity and belonging. The consequence is a generational transmission of the parallel state's values. The child who receives a free pair of sneakers from a shot caller today is the lookout of tomorrow and the burnt asset of next year. This is the cradle-to-grave pipeline that ensures the block never changes. The digital block represents the modern evolution of these ancient street mechanics. While the geography of the neighborhood remains central, the parallel state has expanded into the virtual world. The fact is that social media has become the new sidewalk, where territorial disputes are litigated through videos and posts. The mechanics of cyberbanging involve tagging a rival's digital space, a modern version of spray painting a wall. The paradox of the digital block is that while it allows for a wider reach and faster communication, it also creates a permanent digital trail for federal investigators. The harsh reality is that the same technology that allows a set to market its brand to the world also allows the state to map the entire organization's social network with a few clicks. The consequence is a new era of hyper-evidence, where a soldier's desire for digital status becomes the primary tool for their own legal downfall. The parallel state is struggling to adapt to this new environment, where the old rules of silence are constantly being violated by the new urge to be seen. The invisible economy of the block is not limited to narcotics. It encompasses a vast array of secondary markets: boosted, stolen, retail goods, unlicensed cigarettes, predatory lending, and even the rental of identities. The fact is that the parallel state functions as a complete shadow version of a capitalist society. The mechanics of these secondary markets provide the grease that keeps the neighborhood functioning when the official economy fails. The paradox is that this shadow economy is entirely extractive. It does not create new wealth. It merely recirculates and devalues existing assets. The harsh reality is that the deals found on the street, the discounted electronics, or the low-interest street loan come with a hidden social tax that keeps the community in a state of perpetual poverty. The consequence is the poverty trap, where the convenience of the informal economy makes the climb into the legitimate economy seem impossible. The judiciary of the yard is the final court of the parallel state. When the state removes a soldier from the street and places them in the prison system, the parallel state is already waiting for them. The fact is that the prison yard is where the most senior legislation is drafted and where the ultimate sentence is carried out. The mechanics of the yard are even more rigid than those of the street. There are racial mandates, workout requirements, and knowledge tests that every inmate must pass to survive. The paradox of the prison system is that it is the university of the parallel state. An individual who enters as a low-level corner boy often emerges as a sophisticated administrator of the street's laws. The harsh reality is that the state's attempts to rehabilitate or punish through incarceration often backfire, providing the parallel state with a centralized location to organize and professionalize its leadership. The consequence is that the prison-to-street pipeline is the strongest infrastructure in the neighborhood, a closed loop of governance that the official state has proven unable to break. The unifying theory of the block concludes with the recognition that the parallel state is a mirror. It is a reflection of the society that allows it to exist. It is the shadow cast by a legal system that is perceived as inaccessible, an economic system that is perceived as rigged, and a social system that has abandoned its most vulnerable territories. The cycle of the streets is nearly impossible to break because it is not just a collection of crimes. It is a functional, albeit brutal, response to a vacuum of legitimate power. The no-snitching code is not a lack of morality. It is a survival strategy in a world where the police arrive only to take a report, but the street arrives to take a life. The green light is not random murder. It is a clinical enforcement of a contract. The territorial markers are not graffiti. They are the boundaries of a sovereign state. The streets do not change because the alternative, the official state, has not yet proven itself to be more reliable, more consistent, or more protective than the block. The parallel state provides a sense of order in a world of chaos, even if that order is built on a foundation of blood and fear. It is a cold, utilitarian system that views human life as a variable, but it is a system that works for those who have nothing else. The block's brand will continue to endure as long as the conditions that created it remain unchanged. It is a dark social contract, written in the margins of the American dream, signed by those who were never invited to the table. As we close this investigation, we must realize that the invisible city is not a separate world. It is a part of our own, a parallel state that operates with a brutal efficiency right beneath our feet. The weight of this unspoken law is felt most heavily by those who simply wish to live their lives in peace. They are the silent majority, caught between an official state that has failed them and a parallel state that exploits them. For them, the block is not a topic for a documentary. It is a daily reality of negotiation and survival. The shot callers and the soldiers are the visible actors. But the true story of the parallel state is written in the quiet endurance of the people who call these territories home. They know the laws better than any attorney, for they live with the consequences of breaking them every single day. If you seek to understand the mechanics of power, do not look to the halls of government. Look to the block where the laws are unspoken, the justice is immediate, and the silence is absolute. If you value this deep and analytical exploration into the systemic realities of the street and the sociology of the parallel state, your support is vital. One way to ensure we can continue to bring these hard facts to light is by simply liking this video and subscribing to Tales from the Block. It is the only way we can continue to document the world that society prefers to keep hidden.